Have you ever had someone point out something that you do and now it's all you can focus on? When I was a bit younger, I got told I said like after every sentence and at the beginning of every sentence, and it's all I could ever notice. Now people get annoyed when I say thingio. I don't think I say it that much, but now everyone points it out to me every single day. Or when I watch one of these videos and Sophia told me I blink constantly. You become more aware of it. And the last one is when eating a biscuit or chocolate, I wouldn't think twice about just scoffing the whole lot. But when it comes to the final one, I take small bits just to savor the taste. And over the next few weeks, as we move towards Easter weekend, we'll be looking at some of the last things Jesus said to his disciples before he was killed. And these are some of the most profound things we see written down by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. As if it was him saying, hey guys, just before I go, I need to tell you something. And some of you might be listening and thinking, I don't know what I think about the Bible. Or some of you might be thinking, I'm not too sure what to make of Jesus. But what can't be questioned is the words Jesus said have had a crazy impact on the world and culture in a positive way. And the fact that these words were written down is a good thing. Because we all tend to forget things, right? Like we forget where we put our wallets or our keys or our phone or our homework, if we even bothered to do the homework, or we forget that we had homework altogether. And not only that, but our forgetfulness can be one of the biggest barriers to healthy relationships. We forget a friend's birthday and it looks like we just don't care. Or we forget the promise we made to meet someone and it hurts their feelings. Or we forget to say thank you and it comes across that we take them for granted. We only remember what we want to remember, or maybe we just remember the things that impact the stuff right in front of us. This selective memory can impact our relationship with God too. When life gets overwhelming or difficult, we can begin to forget about God because we are so focused on what's happening right in front of us. In fact, I think Jesus knew that about us. He knew we'd forget, and so he shares something with his closest friends to help them out before it ever becomes a problem. Jesus and his closest followers, known as the disciples, were having a dinner. It was just like any other meal, though it was the Passover meal, which is this part of a huge important tradition and celebration. What the disciples didn't realize was that it would be their last meal with Jesus before his death. Jesus, however, knew that. And because of that, he shared some of the important things with the people he was closest to. Like, real quick, imagine if you were having one of the last conversations with the people you love most. What would you say before you left? If you're anything like me, you have no clue what you'd actually say in that moment, but you'd want it to be important. You'd want those words to actually matter. And it's easy to imagine that Jesus felt the same way. Maybe that's why he didn't waste any of those final words. Some of his last words have shaped history and the future, and they have completely redefined what it meant to trust God. But before we get into exactly what Jesus said, let's talk about this dinner party, what it was all about. See, hundreds of years before Jesus arrived on earth, God miraculously saved the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. The Egyptian Pharaoh had been using the Jewish people as slaves, and since that meant that he got to build this kingdom out of free labour, he wasn't planning on just letting them go. So God sent a messenger, Moses, to request that the enslaved people be released. Then every time Pharaoh said no, God sent a new plague to get under his skin and speed up the process. There were plagues of things like frogs and bugs. Over and over, God sent a wave of something challenging to get Pharaoh's attention and remind him why he should release the enslaved people. The last plague was really awful though. The firstborn child of every family died. And it's morbid, I know. For the Israelite families, however, there was a way out. They were told to place some lamb's blood on the doors as a sign that they were Israelite people. And in the night, God would pass over the firstborn male in those homes and allow them to live. The Israelite people obeyed the instructions and their child was saved from the last plague. And it caused so much pain in Egypt that Pharaoh finally allowed them to leave. And it was the end of slavery and a new beginning for the Israelite people. From that moment on, the Israelites, now known as the Jewish people, have had a tradition of remembering the Passover. They have a meal to celebrate how God had rescued their ancestors, and they gather around the table, much like many of us do today during Christmas and Easter, and retell the stories of how they were once slaves, but God rescued them. They made a habit of remembering. They didn't just assume that they'd always know how God was faithful to them. So they set aside time, but put it in their calendar and got intentional about telling the story about how it happened. And just like many of our holiday traditions include food, so do theirs. And part of the meal was eating bread that didn't have yeast in it, so it was really thin, and drinking wine. Hang on while I show you what I mean. We often take communion like this, with wafer and a juice, but originally this would have been unleavened bread. So not quite like the bread we have here, even though this is what some people might use now, but it was a flat bread that had no yeast in it. And this represented how quickly the Israelites left Egypt because there was no time for the yeast to work in the bread and the bread to rise. Now, the wine represented the blood of the lambs that were sacrificed to save the Jews. Have we got it? This brings us back to the table where Jesus is celebrating. Remember, Jesus was Jewish. He grew up celebrating, remembering and retelling the stories of the Passover along with his family. And now he was doing the same thing with his disciples. They probably all knew how the dinner was supposed to go and how the story was supposed to be told. But then Jesus did something new. Check this out. It says, he took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." This was a huge moment for the disciples. Even though they may not have understood what Jesus meant, they knew he had just changed the meaning of the whole tradition. They had always celebrated and remembered what had happened long ago in Egypt, but now it was about remembering what he was about to do. The bread and the wine represented his body and his blood. And he was saying, these things now represent my incredible love for you, which has compelled me to live with you and die for you. Every time you eat the bread and drink this wine, I want you to remember me. Remember my sacrifice for you. Remember my great love for you. What I love about this moment is that it's about so much more than a holiday. Passover was a special time of remembering, but what about the bread and the wine? Jewish people had those everyday things. It was a normal food for them. Jesus made the two most ordinary parts of their lives significant. Jesus wanted them to remember him every time they ate and they drank. Why? Because Jesus knew what life would be difficult and painful, not just for the disciples, but for everyone who would read his words in the future, including us. Jesus knew that in those difficult moments, it's easy for us to get caught up in what's right in front of us and forget where we'd come from, or to focus on the bad and forget the good, or to forget that Jesus died for us to demonstrate his great love for us. Jesus knows we tend to forget, so before he left, he taught the disciples to remember. And why is this so important? Well, simply put, remembering reminds us of what Jesus has done, is doing, and will continue to do. Remembering isn't about being sentimental. It's a foundation of our faith. The things we look back on are the moments that help us continue to grow in our faith. For those of you who have been following Jesus for a long time, I'm guessing there have been some significant moments that you can remember. Like when Jesus did something for you, whether it was at Limitless Festival or serving our community or in youth or with your family, when you decided to follow him, when he answered your prayers. And in those moments, it's easy to trust him. It's easy to know that he's there and he's good. But I'm also guessing that you don't feel that way every day of your life. It's easy to feel far away or forget why you ever trusted Jesus in the first place. If that's you, I want you to know something. Jesus hasn't changed. He's the same as he was when you first met him and experienced him. He was the same when you met him at Limitless Festival, or when you made that first decision to follow him, or at that worship night experience. He's the same as he was the first Passover, and the same as he was at the Last Supper. Like, God doesn't change, and Jesus is God in a human body. And we just have to remember who God is and what God has done for us. Two things to keep in mind. The first is remembering with other people is powerful. Like, the Jewish people observed the Passover meal to remind their community of God's love, protection and faithfulness to them. They remember their history of God's presence with them and their people in difficult times. They reflect on God's steady guidance and direction in the big picture of life. So, what are the ways that God has been faithful in your life? There's just something powerful about both sharing stories about God's faithfulness with other people and hearing stories about how God has been in transforming other people's lives. Like, what would it look like to celebrate God's faithfulness together here at Limitless Southport? The second is, remember, it takes work. Maybe you've never done this before. The truth is, it's a practice and it takes repetition. It's one thing to remember God's goodness, but we need to keep going back to those memories to keep them at the forefront of our minds. Also, pay attention when God shows up and does something on your behalf now. Like we've said, over time we tend to forget. And the Jewish people don't just celebrate Passover when life is difficult. Instead, they've scheduled a specific, consistent, intentional time to revisit a moment when God delivered their community in a huge way. Remembering allows us to trust God even when it's hard to see how God is working. Remembering helps us to see God in the past so we can trust God in the present. Like, here's what I know. You are 100% guaranteed to go through difficult times in life. So it's important to decide now that those difficult times won't derail your trust in God. None of us are exempt from the challenging moments, but when you experience challenges in the present and in the future, you can lean on the one who has always been there for you in the past. Remembering reminds us of what Jesus has done, is doing, and will continue to do.